Picture a single log, not a log you could lift, not a log two men could roll, a log so massive it weighs more than a steam locomotive, 100 tons of old-growth redwood cut from a tree that was growing when the Roman Empire fell. Now picture 20 oxen, 40 hooves, churning mud, chains pulled so tight they hum like guitar strings, and behind them, wooden wheels 12 feet tall, creaking under a weight they were never truly designed to bear. It will take all day to move this tree 1 mile. 1 mile, 1 tree, 1 day, 20 animals, a dozen men. And if anything goes wrong, if a chain snaps, if an ox stumbles, if those massive wheels hit a root wrong, men will die. They died all the time. This is how America's greatest trees were moved before engines existed. Not by machines, not by railroads, by flesh and blood and iron will. By animals that weighed a ton each and men who understood those animals better than they understood their own families. We remember the lumberjacks who cut the trees. We have photographs of them standing in the stumps looking small. But we have almost forgotten the men who moved those trees once they fell. The bull punchers, the teamsters, the ox drivers who performed daily miracles of physics with nothing but animal muscle and wooden wheels. This is their story. And it is more brutal, sure, more ingenious, and more physically demanding than anything happening in the forest today. Before we talk about the oxen, you need to understand the problem they were solving, because the problem seemed impossible. By the 1850s, logging crews in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California had discovered trees unlike anything Europeans had ever seen. Coast redwoods, giant sequoias, Douglas firs that had been growing since before the Crusades. These weren't trees, they were monuments. A single redwood could measure 20 feet across at the base. The trunk alone, before any branches, could run 200 feet straight up. When one of these trees hit the ground, the impact registered on seismographs miles away. And here was the problem. The sawmills that could turn these trees into lumber sat at the edge of rivers, or at the coast, or next to railroad lines. The trees themselves stood miles into the wilderness, up steep ravines, across muddy hollows, in terrain that would break a wagon in 5 minutes. Horses couldn't do it. A draft horse can pull maybe 2,000 pounds on a good road. These logs weighed 200,000 pounds. You would need 100 horses just to equal the weight, and 100 horses can't coordinate. They would tear each other apart trying to pull together. Railroads couldn't reach most cutting sites. The terrain was too rough. Sure, the investment too expensive for a stand of trees that might be logged out in 3 years. Flumes and chutes could move logs downhill, but someone still had to get them from the stump to the flume. Steam tractors existed by the 1880s, but they were fragile. They threw tracks. They bogged down in mud. They started fires in dry conditions. And most importantly, they couldn't navigate the narrow, twisting paths between giant trees. There was only one technology that could solve this problem. An ancient technology. The same technology that built the pyramids and plowed the first fields. Oxen. Oxen had been pulling loads since before recorded history. Egyptians used them. Romans used them. Every civilization that moved heavy objects over land used them. But American loggers were about to push the ox to the absolute limit of what the animal could physically accomplish. The math alone tells you how insane this operation was. A well-trained ox can pull about twice its own body weight under ideal conditions. An ox weighs roughly 2,000 pounds. So one ox, pulling hard, straining against its yoke, might move 4,000 pounds. Now consider that log. 100 tons, 200,000 pounds. To move it, you would need 50 oxen if each one pulled at maximum capacity. But oxen don't pull at maximum capacity for hours at a time. They get tired. They need rest. Their muscles burn and their lungs heave and their hearts pound. And they can't all pull in perfect unison. Some slacken the chains, some pull harder than others. So the loggers cheated. They didn't drag the logs, they rolled them. And to roll them, they invented one of the strangest, most improbable pieces of equipment in industrial history. They called them big wheels. And once you see one, you understand exactly why. Imagine a pair of wheels connected by a single axle. Now imagine those wheels are 12 feet in diameter. Some were 14 feet. The largest ever built stood 16 feet tall. higher than most two-story windows. They were made entirely of wood, oak and hickory mostly, woods chosen for their strength and flexibility. Later versions used iron rims to prevent wear, but the spokes and hubs remained wood because metal was simply too heavy. Here's how they worked. The big wheels rolled over the fallen log until the axle sat directly above the log at its thickest point. Heavy chains dropped down from the axle and wrapped under the log like hands cradling a sleeping giant. When the chains pulled tight, the front of the log lifted partially off the ground. Not completely. The back end of the log still dragged, but the front end, the heaviest end, hung suspended from that axle. Now you weren't dragging 200,000 pounds through the mud. You were rolling a pair of giant wheels while maybe half the log's weight dragged behind. It was still an enormous load. But it was possible. Just barely possible. The wheels themselves were engineering marvels. The spokes had to be thick enough to bear the weight, but light enough that the oxen could actually turn them. The hubs were often 2 feet across, solid hardwood fitted with iron sleeves to prevent wear. The rims were sometimes 8 inches wide to spread the weight across soft ground and keep the wheels from sinking. Building a set of big wheels took a skilled wheelwright 2 weeks of constant work. A good pair cost more than most men earned in a year. And they broke constantly. Spokes shattered under load, exploding into splinters. Hubs cracked down the middle. Axles bent under loads they were never truly designed to carry. But they worked. When nothing else in the world could move a tree, except big wheels could move it. For smaller logs, logging operations use different equipment. Some use simple wooden sleds with iron runners called go-devils. The log sat on the sled, and oxen dragged the whole thing across skid roads. Others use logging carts with smaller wheels, maybe 8 or 10 feet in diameter, suitable for trees under 50 tons. But for the giants, for the true monarchs of the forest, only the biggest wheels would do. And only the best ox teams could pull them. Let me tell you about those teams, because the animals themselves were far more remarkable than most people realize. First, forget everything you think you know about oxen. These were not the slow, stupid beasts of popular imagination. A logging ox was an athlete, a 1,000-pound problem solver that had been trained since birth for one specific purpose. Logging oxen were almost always steers, which are castrated male cattle. Bulls were too aggressive, so too likely to fight each other or charge their handlers. Cows were too valuable for breeding and milk production. Steers had exactly the right combination of strength, size, and trainable temperament. The best logging oxen came from specific bloodlines that handlers knew and sought out. Durham cattle were popular in the California Redwood region. So were Devons, a breed known for their endurance, their intelligence, and their distinctive red coloring. In the Pacific Northwest, many operations favored crosses between Durham and native range cattle, creating animals that were large, strong, and acclimated to the perpetually wet climate. Training began when the animals were yearlings, barely a year old and still awkward in their growing bodies. They learned to respond to voice commands that would govern their entire working lives. G meant turn right. Haw meant turn left. Whoa meant stop immediately. Get up meant move forward. These weren't suggestions. They weren't gentle requests. An ox that didn't respond instantly was useless. An ox that hesitated could get itself and every animal around it killed. The animals worked in pairs called yokes. The yoke was a heavy wooden beam that sat across the necks of 2 oxen, binding them together as a single unit. The yoke distributed the pulling force across both animals' shoulders and necks, rather than concentrating it in one spot. A properly fitted yoke let an ox pull with its entire body weight, and not just its neck muscles. Fitting a yoke was an art passed down from handler to handler. Too loose, and it would slide and chafe, creating raw wounds that would eventually become infected. Too tight, and it would restrict breathing, limiting the animal's endurance. The sweet spot allowed the ox to breathe freely while keeping the yoke from shifting. Pairing oxen was another art entirely. You wanted animals of similar size and strength, so neither one was doing more than its share of the work. But you also wanted complementary temperaments, a nervous ox paired with a calm partner who could steady it, a quick ox paired with a more deliberate one who could set a sustainable pace. Teams that worked well together could anticipate each other's movements, leaning into turns before the command came, adjusting their pace without being told. Some pairs worked together for their entire careers, a decade or more of shared labor. When one died, the survivor often became useless, unable to accept a new partner, pining for its lost yokemate in ways that looked unmistakably like grief. A big log required multiple yokes working in sequence. This was called a bull team. The lead yoke walked at the front, setting the pace and direction. Behind them came the swing yokes, usually 2 or 3 pairs that provided the bulk of the pulling power. At the back, closest to the load, walked the wheel yokes, the strongest and steadiest animals, who bore the initial strain of getting the load moving. 20 oxen meant 10 yokes, 10 pairs of animals that had to work in perfect coordination or the whole system collapsed. If the lead pair walked too fast, the chain went slack and the swing team stumbled. If the wheel pair pulled too hard at the start, they could break the chain or injure the animals in front. If any single animal faltered, stumbled, or panicked, the entire operation stopped. The man who controlled all of this was called the bull puncher. Sometimes he was called the bull whacker. The name comes from the tools of his trade, a long wooden goad for close work and an even longer whip that could reach any animal in the team. Bull punchers were the aristocrats of the logging camp. They earned more than fellers, more than buckers, often more than the foreman himself, and they earned every penny of it. A bull puncher walked alongside his team for miles every day, through mud that sucked at his boots and tried to pull them off, across logs that rolled under his feet, in rain that never seemed to stop. He knew every animal by name. He knew their moods, their limitations, their little quirks. That ox limps slightly on cold mornings, needs extra time to warm up. This one gets nervous around running water, has to be talked through stream crossings. That pair works better on the left side of the team than the right. He commanded them with voice alone when things went well. Gee, Jack. Ha, Blue. Easy, boys. Easy now. His voice was calm, steady, almost musical. The oxen responded to tone as much as words. A bull puncher who sounded nervous made his team nervous. A bull puncher who sounded confident made his team confident. But when things went wrong, when a chain slipped or a wheel hit a hidden root, or an ox started to panic, the bull puncher had maybe 3 seconds to prevent a disaster. 3 seconds to crack his whip, shout the right command, physically grab an animal if he had to, and pray the team listened. The good ones developed almost telepathic connections with their teams. There are accounts of bull punchers who could move a 20 ox team through a gap between 2 standing trees with less than a foot of clearance on either side. They did this by knowing exactly how each animal would respond, exactly how much space the big wheels needed, and exactly where to position themselves so the animals could hear their voice above the grinding of the chains. The bad ones got men killed. And there were plenty of bad ones, especially in the early years before anyone really understood what they were doing. One of the most famous bull punchers in California history was a man named John Dolbear. Before he invented the steam donkey engine that would eventually replace the oxen entirely, Dolbear ran bull teams in the redwood forests near Eureka. He reportedly could move logs that other teamsters declared impossible, navigating grades so steep the big wheels nearly tipped backward, crossing ravines on corduroy bridges that flexed and groaned under the weight. Another legendary teamster was known only as Oregon Charlie. He worked the Douglas fir forests of the Pacific Northwest in the 1870s and claimed to have never lost an ox to injury in 15 years of driving. That's almost certainly an exaggeration, but the fact that he felt the need to make the claim tells you how common injuries were. Losing oxen was expected. Not losing them was remarkable enough to brag about. The work was brutal on the animals. Oxen don't sweat like horses. They cool themselves by panting and seeking shade, neither of which is possible when you're chained to 19 other animals and pulling a 100-ton log through the forest. A logging ox had to keep pulling, keep straining, and even as its body temperature climbed to dangerous levels. The good bull punchers knew when to rest their teams. They watched for signs of heat stress, for stumbling, for the particular kind of heavy breathing that meant an animal was approaching collapse. They carried wooden buckets and dipped water from every stream they crossed to pour over the oxen's necks and sides. They planned their routes to include shady stretches where the animals could cool down. The bad bull punchers drove their teams until the animals dropped, and when an ox collapsed from heat exhaustion in harness, the whole operation stopped dead. The dying animal had to be cut free from its yoke. The other oxen had to be rearranged, yokes readjusted, positions changed. The entire team's rhythm was destroyed, and it might take hours to get moving again. Logging companies went through oxen the way factories go through machinery. A healthy ox might last 5 or 6 years in logging work before its legs gave out, its lungs failed, or an accident ended its career. Some lasted longer if they were lucky and well cared for. Some died their first season if they weren't. The mountains of the Pacific Northwest are littered with ox bones, most of them unmarked, all of them representing an animal that gave its life to move trees. But we haven't talked about the routes yet, the paths these teams followed. Because building those paths was almost as difficult as moving the logs themselves. Picture the forest. Not a park forest with walking trails and scenic clearings. A true old-growth forest where every square foot of ground is occupied by something. Fallen logs rotting back into the earth, brush growing head-high in any spot where sunlight penetrates the canopy, ferns that hide ankle-breaking holes and skull-cracking rocks, mud that forms whenever rain falls, which in the Pacific Northwest is essentially always from October through May. You cannot move big wheels through this. The wheels would catch on brush and stop dead. They would drop into hidden holes and snap their axles. They would sink in mud until the axle touched the ground, and the whole system became unmovable. Before a single log could travel anywhere, someone had to build a road. These were called skid roads. The name comes from the logs that form their surface, and the technique would eventually give us the word skid row for the rundown districts where unemployed loggers gathered. Here's how the original roads worked. First, a crew of men called swampers cleared the route. They cut brush with machetes and axes, removed fallen logs that blocked the way, and graded the worst bumps and holes. This was backbreaking work done entirely with hand tools, axes and mattocks and shovels. When swung from dawn to dusk in air thick with mosquitoes and the smell of rotting vegetation. A crew of 10 swampers might clear a quarter-mile of path in a day of hard labor. Behind them came another crew who laid the skids themselves. These were logs, usually smaller trees cut specifically for the purpose, placed crosswise across the road at intervals of about 8 feet. The logs were half buried in the ground, so their top surfaces sat roughly level with the surrounding earth. When the big wheels rolled over these skids, the weight was distributed across solid wood rather than soft earth. The wheels couldn't sink because they were always rolling over wood. The skid logs also provided a kind of low-friction surface for the dragging portion of the log. Bull punchers greased the skids with whatever was available: animal fat, whale oil, or later with petroleum products. A well-greased skid road let the dragging portion of the log slide relatively easily, reducing the pull required from the oxen. Building skid roads was engineering, even if the men doing it would never have called it that. You couldn't just lay logs anywhere and hope for the best. The grade had to be carefully controlled. Too steep downhill and the load would run away, crushing the oxen. Too steep uphill, and the animals couldn't pull it at all. The ideal grade was a gentle downslope, maybe 2 or 3%, just enough to help the load along without making it dangerous. Curves were even trickier than grades. Big wheels don't turn easily. The longer the log being hauled, the wider the turning radius required. A 100-foot log needs a curve that sweeps out 60 or 70 feet just to make a 90-degree turn without catching on something. If the curve was too tight, the back of the log would catch on stumps or standing trees, stopping the entire operation. Crossings were the most dangerous part of any route. Streams, ravines, gullies. These required bridges, when the bridges had to hold not just the oxen and the wheels, but the full weight of the log dragging behind. The simplest crossings used corduroy construction. Logs laid lengthwise across the gap, covered with crosswise poles, covered with brush and dirt to create a relatively smooth surface. These bridges flexed under heavy loads. You could feel them bounce beneath your feet. You could hear them groan like something alive. And occasionally they collapsed entirely, so dropping oxen and logs and men into the water or ravine below. More permanent crossings used crib construction. This meant building up walls of logs on either side of the gap, filling the space between with rocks and earth, creating a solid causeway that could bear any weight. Crib crossings took weeks to build, but they lasted for years and could handle the heaviest loads the forest could produce. The men who built these roads were not remembered. We don't know their names. And they didn't pose for photographs with their shovels and mattocks. They were just part of the anonymous labor force that made everything else possible. But without their work, not a single log would have moved. They were the invisible foundation of the entire logging industry. Now picture the actual operation, a day in the life of an ox logging crew. Dawn comes early in the forest, earlier than anywhere else because the trees block the light until the sun is well up. Oh, but the men are already awake. The cook has been working since 4 in the morning, preparing a breakfast that would stagger a modern nutritionist. Flapjacks by the stack, swimming in butter and molasses, salt pork fried in its own fat until it crackles, beans that have been simmering all night, coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, kept hot in a pot that never seems to empty. The men will burn 6,000 calories today. They need every bite they can swallow. While the men eat, the bull puncher is already with his oxen. The animals spent the night in a corral near the camp, eating hay that was hauled in from farms miles away. Keeping 20 oxen fed is a logistics operation in itself. Each animal needs 30 pounds of hay per day, plus whatever grazing it can do in spare moments. That's 600 pounds of hay daily, almost 2 tons per week, all of it transported over those same terrible roads by other ox teams. The bull puncher checks each animal like a doctor making rounds. He looks at their feet for stones or injuries, feels their legs for heat that might indicate strain or infection, examines the spots where the yokes rest for raw patches or developing sores. An injured ox is a useless ox. Worse, an injured ox can panic under load and injure the healthy animals around it. The swampers have already left camp. They're up the road somewhere, clearing today's route, greasing the skids, checking the bridges for any damage from yesterday's passage. The fellers left even earlier, before first light, heading to the cutting site where they'll drop another giant for tomorrow's haul. Around 7 in the morning, the bull puncher begins yoking his team. Each pair of oxen knows their partners, knows their position in the sequence. They move into place without much urging, ducking their heavy heads under the wooden beams, waiting patiently for the iron pins that lock them in. The lead pair goes first. These are the smartest animals, the ones who understand voice commands best, the ones who can pick a path through obstacles without constant direction. Behind them come the swing pairs, the workhorses of the operation. Then the wheel pair, the strongest and steadiest animals, positioned closest to the load where they will bear the initial strain of getting everything moving. Chains connect each yoke to the one in front of it. The chains are forged iron, for heavy links that can bear 20,000 pounds of tension. At the back of the team, a longer chain runs to the big wheels, which were positioned over today's log yesterday evening when the light was still good. The bull puncher walks the length of his team, checking each connection. A single weak link, a single improperly secured pin, and the whole system fails at the worst possible moment. He has seen it happen. He has seen chains snap under load, whipping backward with enough force to cut a man clean in half. He checks everything twice, then checks it again. By 8 o'clock, the operation begins. The bull puncher takes his position, usually walking alongside the lead pair where his voice can be heard clearly over the noise of the forest. He carries his goad in one hand, his whip coiled over his shoulder. "Get up," he calls. The command passes down the line like a wave. 20 heads lower, 40 legs brace against the muddy ground. The chains pull tight with a sound like guitar strings being tuned, lifting the front of the log maybe a foot off the ground. The back end digs into the skids, grinding against the greased wood. For a long moment, nothing moves. The load is too heavy. The animals strain, but the wheels don't turn. You can see the muscles bunching under their hides. You can hear their breath coming harder. This is the hardest part of the whole operation, the initial break. onto getting the whole system from rest into motion. Get up! Get up! The bull puncher's voice rises. The whip cracks over the team's heads, not touching them, just the sound, the signal that more effort is required. The oxen dig deeper. Their hooves churn the mud, throwing up clots of black earth. Muscles roll under their hides like waves on a troubled ocean. And then slowly, the wheels begin to turn. 1 inch, 2 inches. The chains clank. The axle groans. The back of the log slides forward across the first skid with a sound like a giant clearing its throat. Once moving, the load is easier to keep moving. Newton's first law in action, 100 tons of timber continuing in motion until something stops it. The bull puncher's voice settles into a rhythm. Easy, boys. Easy now. G, Jack. G. The lead pair drifts right, following a slight curve in the road. The animals behind follow, the movement rippling down the line like a wave. This continues for hours. The road might run a mile from the cutting site to the landing where logs are collected. At 2 miles per hour, the best speed an ox team can manage with a heavy load. That's 30 minutes of continuous pulling. But you can't pull continuously. The animals need rest. Every few hundred yards, the bull puncher calls a halt, lets the team breathe, pours water over their necks from a bucket if a stream is nearby. Then they start again. The initial break, the strain, the slow acceleration, the grinding forward progress. Around noon, they reach the landing. This is a cleared area, usually on a riverbank, or next to a railroad spur, where logs accumulate before being transported to the mill. The big wheels roll up a wooden ramp, and the chains are released. The log drops with a thud that shakes the ground and sends birds screaming from the nearby trees. Another tree has completed its journey from standing timber to industrial product. The oxen rest while the men eat lunch. The animals are unhitched, watered, allowed to graze on whatever foliage grows near the landing. The bull puncher walks among them, checking again for injuries, for heat stress, for any sign that an animal can't handle the afternoon's work. After lunch, they do it again. Back up the road, empty this time, the big wheels rolling easily without a load. At the cutting site, another log waits. The fellers dropped it this morning. The buckers have cut it to length. The loaders have rolled it into position using cant hooks and raw muscle. The big wheels roll over the new log. Chains go under. The bull puncher inspects every connection one more time, and the whole process repeats. By dusk, if everything has gone well, 2 logs have reached the landing. 2 trees that were standing this morning are now one step closer to becoming lumber that will build houses and ships and railroad ties. The oxen have walked 4 miles, as maybe 5. They have pulled a combined weight that would crush a locomotive, and they will do it all again tomorrow. But things didn't always go well. The forest was trying to kill these men every single day, and it often succeeded. The most common disaster was a runaway. This happened on downhill grades when the weight of the log overcame the braking power of the oxen. The whole system would accelerate. The log pushing the big wheels, the wheels pushing the oxen, with everyone moving faster and faster until something gave way. Experienced bull punchers knew the warning signs. They could feel the chain tension change when the load started to push rather than drag. They would call for more animals to be hitched as brakes, or they would route around dangerous grades entirely, even if it added miles to the journey. But sometimes there was no warning. A skid log would roll out of position. A wheel would hit a hidden rock. And suddenly, the whole system was moving faster than the lead oxen could walk. When a runaway started, the bull puncher had exactly one option. Get clear. Get out of the path of the wheels, out of the path of the log, and pray his animals could do the same. Most of the time, they couldn't. The oxen were chained together. They couldn't scatter. They could only run forward, trying to outpace the death chasing them. Runaways killed oxen by the dozens. They killed men too. In 1879, a runaway on a skid road near Mendocino caught 3 men who were working on a bridge ahead of the team. They heard the shouting. They heard the thunder of hooves and wheels. But they couldn't get off that bridge in time. The log swept them into the ravine 60 feet below. Chains breaking under load was nearly as deadly. A chain under tension stores enormous energy, like a spring compressed to its limit. When it snaps, that energy releases instantly. The broken chain whips backward, sometimes cutting through anything in its path like a blade. Men learned to stand clear of chains when loads were being started, but standing clear wasn't always possible. Sometimes the path ran between trees, and there was nowhere to stand except next to the chain. Equipment failures took lives regularly, big wheel spokes shattering under load, sending splinters of oak the size of your arm flying in all directions. Axles bending suddenly, or dropping logs onto the men trying to adjust the chains beneath them. Yokes cracking, releasing oxen that panicked and trampled anyone nearby. The forest itself was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the logging operation. Widowmakers, those dead branches hanging in the canopy, fell without any warning. Trees that looked perfectly sound turned out to be rotten at the core, collapsing when a log brushed against their trunks. Mud holes swallowed men to their waists, then their chests, and then their mouths, while their companions struggled to pull them free. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no OSHA inspectors making sure the equipment was sound and the procedures were followed. If you got hurt, you were carried back to camp, and you hoped someone knew enough medicine to save you. If you got killed, you were buried in the forest, often in an unmarked grave, and the operation continued the next morning. We don't know how many men died moving logs with oxen. No one kept comprehensive records. These were expendable men doing dangerous work, and no one thought their deaths were worth documenting. But fragments survive. A logging company's account book showing payments to the families of 3 workers killed in the same month. Cemetery records in logging towns listing cause of death as crushed or accident over and over and over. Newspaper reports of disasters that killed 4, 5, 6 men at once. And we know almost nothing about the oxen themselves. These animals worked until they dropped, quite literally. When an ox could no longer pull, when its legs gave out or its lungs failed, it was slaughtered for meat to feed the camp. When an ox died in harness, it was butchered on the spot and the useful parts hauled back to camp. The bones were left in the forest, where they still emerge occasionally when modern loggers move earth. For 50 years, this was the only way to move the big trees. From the 1850s through the turn of the century, every giant redwood, every massive Douglas fir, every old-growth cedar that became lumber traveled at least part of its journey behind an ox team. But the technology that would end the era was already being developed. In 1881, John Dolbear, the same man who had been a legendary bull puncher in his younger days, patented a device he called the steam donkey. It was a relatively simple machine, a steam boiler powering a winch drum, which could reel in steel cable attached to logs. The cable was strung through pulleys anchored to stumps, allowing a single machine to drag logs from a wide area toward a central point. The steam donkey didn't replace oxen immediately. Early versions were unreliable, prone to boiler explosions and mechanical failures that killed their operators. They also couldn't move themselves. Getting a steam donkey to a new logging site required, ironically, ox teams to haul it through the forest. But the advantages were obvious to anyone who watched one operate. A steam donkey didn't need food except wood for the fire and water for the boiler. It didn't get tired. It didn't panic. It could pull all day, all night if necessary, as long as someone kept the fire burning and the boiler fed. By the 1890s, improved steam donkeys were spreading through the Pacific Northwest like a contagion. They could do the work of 50 oxen, and they did it faster. Logging companies that had measured daily output in dozens of logs began measuring in hundreds. The effect on the ox teams was as predictable as gravity. They became obsolete. The transition took decades to complete. Some terrain was still too rough for steam equipment, some operations were too small to afford the capital investment in machinery, and some bull punchers simply refused to give up the work they knew, the animals they had trained and tended and loved. But year by year, the ox teams dwindled. The logging camps that had once employed dozens of bull punchers employed 1 or 2, then none at all. The corrals that had held hundreds of oxen stood empty, then collapsed, then rotted back into the forest from which they had been built. The last commercial ox logging in the United States probably occurred sometime in the 1920s, in remote operations that had never modernized because they couldn't afford to or didn't see the point. By then, steam had already given way to gasoline and diesel. Tractors had replaced even the steam donkeys. The entire era of animal-powered logging had become history. Today, almost nothing physical remains. A few big wheels survive in logging museums, looking impossibly large to modernize, accustomed to rubber tires and steel rims. Some yellowing photographs show ghostly teams of oxen standing in mud up to their hocks, their faces patient, their drivers standing beside them with whips coiled. And somewhere in the forests of California and Oregon and Washington, the bones of those oxen are still returning slowly to the earth. They rest in the same soil they watered with their sweat, among the stumps of the trees they moved. Forgotten by the industry they helped to build. Here's what I want you to understand when you think about this history. What these men and animals accomplished was impossible. It was literally impossible by any reasonable engineering calculation you might perform today. The weights were too heavy, the distances were too far, the conditions were too brutal, the equipment was too primitive. They did it anyway. Not because they were smarter than us, or stronger than us, or braver than us, but because they had no other choice. The trees were there, the lumber was needed. The country was expanding and it needed wood to build with. And nothing in the world but oxen and wooden wheels could bridge the gap between the standing forest and the sawmill. We live in their inheritance. Every wooden building constructed before 1900 in California or the Pacific Northwest exists because of ox teams. Every railroad built through the western forests used ties cut from trees that oxen moved. The economic development of the entire West Coast was built, quite literally, on the backs of oxen and the shoulders of the men who drove them. And we have forgotten them almost completely. We remember the lumberjacks who cut the trees. We have their photographs, their songs, their folklore. We remember the railroad builders who laid the tracks. We sometimes remember the sawmill workers who turned logs into lumber, but the men who drove the oxen, the animals that pulled until they died, the impossible system of wooden wheels and iron chains that made the whole thing work, they've slipped from memory like water through cupped hands. The next time you see a photograph of a giant redwood stump with men standing inside it, I want you to think about what happened next. After the tree fell, after the photograph was taken, after the fellers moved on to the next tree, someone had to move that tree, and they did it with 20 oxen, 12-foot wheels, and a kind of courage we can barely comprehend today. That's the story. 1 mile, 1 tree, 1 day, repeated thousands of times over 50 years across millions of acres. In the biggest logs ever moved by animal power, dragged through mud and rain and impossible terrain by men and beasts who never expected to be remembered. They deserve better than that. We owe them the weight of acknowledgement at least. The recognition that before we had engines, we had only muscle and will, and the deep patience of oxen who pulled until the chains broke or their hearts gave out. Some debts we can never repay, but we can remember who we owe them to. If you stayed until the end of this, you understand something that most people never learn. The world we live in was built by people who did impossible things, and we've let them become invisible. Hit subscribe. I cover the forgotten labor that built everything we take for granted. And if you want to see another piece of this hidden history, the video on your screen right now will show you exactly what I mean.